Our channel shares stories that actually happened. Do you know or have experienced any shocking stories? We also tell the stories of our subscribers. Leave them in the comments so we can share them with the world. We want to hear from you. He never imagined that a simple act from his son could completely transform his life and his own. That day, his child's desperate attempt to save him took him to a place he had never anticipated. The situation he was in was so critical that he felt everything around him was collapsing. His house, once comfortable, was now in ruins. The roof leaked with every rain, and the walls seemed to absorb the cold that both he and his son felt inside. He had lost his job and with it all hope for a better future. His physical and mental strength no longer responded as before, but the worst part was that he couldn't feed his son. Despite his efforts, he couldn't provide the basic food a child needs to grow and develop. There were days when, exhausted by the lack of resources, he would stare at the empty fridge, wondering what else he could do. But at the same time, he kept telling himself he had to stay strong for his son. The situation was tough. However, he never imagined that what would happen later that day would change their destinies forever. He was sitting, as usual, at the table, staring at the empty plate in front of him, when he heard the sound of the door opening. His son Henry, a 6-year-old child, burst into the house with eyes overflowing with a desperation he had never seen in him. Without thinking, the child ran straight to the police station, shouting, almost screaming, that they should arrest his father. He couldn't understand it, nor could he process it. His little son, unknowingly, had shown him the limit of his suffering. What Henry didn't know, and what he himself discovered later, was that in that act, the boy was seeking a solution, an escape from his desperation. How could such a small, vulnerable child have come to that conclusion? It was simple for him. In prison, his father would have 3 meals a day, and he too could eat. He didn't think of the implications of his words, just that in this way, his father would stop suffering. What Henry didn't understand, however, was that his father was willing to sacrifice himself for him at all times, at the cost of his own health. What this child did that day was more than a simple attempt to save him from misery. It was a lesson in purity and unconditional love. For him, his sacrifice had no other purpose but to care for his father, to protect him in his own way. While the police investigated and tried to understand the nature of this crime, both their lives were about to change forever. Roger never imagined that the love of his son, so pure and innocent, would lead him to such a critical situation. While the officers investigated and tried to understand what was really happening, he sat on the floor of his house, feeling the pressure of life crush him more and more. For months, he had been sacrificing for his son, giving up his own needs so that Henry could eat, so that he could have what he couldn't provide for himself. The job that had once been his pride, the one he had invested years of study and effort into, was now only a painful memory. He had been fired after uncovering a scandal in the pharmaceutical company where he worked, and his life had taken a drastic turn. Rejection letters piled up, each one like another blow to his self-esteem. He felt trapped in a cycle he couldn't escape, and the worst part was that his son saw him slowly disappearing. He couldn't bear the thought of Henry suffering because of him, because of his inability to give him what he needed. The malnutrition that affected him was also affecting his son, though he never dared to tell Henry the truth. In that moment, shame consumed him. The shame of not being the father his son needed. The shame of seeing the walls of his life collapse while he tried, with all his strength, to keep them standing. In that instant, amid the police investigation, Roger understood something fundamental. The pain of not being able to provide for his son, the humiliation of depending on charity, and his own desperation had led him to a breaking point. He sat with his head in his hands, searching for an answer within himself, but all he found was anguish. What his son had done that morning wasn't just an attempt to save him from poverty. It was a cry for help that went beyond what any adult could have understood. Henry, with his innocence, had come to the conclusion that the best thing for his father was to be arrested so he wouldn't have to keep living like this. What father could understand that his child, with all his love, saw him as so weak, so defeated? Roger knew his son loved him, but he didn't know how much his son was willing to do for him. That afternoon, as the police kept asking questions and Roger felt his life slipping through his fingers, He realized that what Henry had done wasn't just a desperate act, but also a reminder of how deep a son's love can be. A love that had pushed him to act without thinking, simply looking for a way to give his father what he could never give him: food, security, well-being. After that incident at the police station, Roger spent several sleepless nights thinking about how he had reached this point. Guilt weighed on his chest like a stone. Even though he had given everything for his son, everything he had done seemed insufficient. His eyes were closing from lack of rest, but he couldn't sleep because every time he closed his eyes, the first thing he saw was his son running to the police, asking for help in the most innocent way. He couldn't understand how he had gotten to this place. The idea that Henry had thought the best thing for him was to have his father arrested so they could eat devastated him. Deep down, he knew that what Henry had done had been a form of protection, but the pain of seeing how his son perceived the situation as a whole was unbearable. He felt trapped, as if he had failed as a father and didn't know how to get out of this vicious cycle. That night, while sitting alone at the small kitchen table, something changed within him. He began to remember the times when, before losing everything, he felt like he had control. He remembered the love he felt for his wife Emily, and how when they were together everything seemed possible. But now, in this devastating solitude, he felt like everything was out of his reach. The man he had been, the man who had believed in justice and truth, seemed to have disappeared completely. However, something inside him, though small, was still fighting to cling to that spark of hope that had defined him before. He thought about his son. Henry was as lost as he was, looking for answers where there were none. Roger knew he had to be the one to take control, that he couldn't give up, that he couldn't let his son grow up with the same feeling of helplessness he felt at that moment. He decided he had to rise out of the darkness he was in. He had to find a way to overcome all of this, to find a way out for himself and his son. The night didn't end with clear answers, but something within him awoke. He knew that even though his situation seemed hopeless, he couldn't give up. There was something bigger at stake: his son, his life, his future. That thought kept him awake, not from fear, but from a renewed determination. The next day was different. Although still exhausted, the determination that had emerged in his heart the night before kept him alert. Roger knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let shame, guilt, or desperation dominate him. Henry needed him, and although he felt incapable, he could no longer afford to feel defeated. He decided to leave the house early in the morning, hoping to find some way to get help, to regain some control over his life. He spent hours walking around the city, looking for jobs where he could apply his knowledge, even looking for temporary jobs or areas where his experience as a biologist might be useful, even if in a secondary role. Everything he found, however, were closed doors. He received indifferent looks, and the few responses he received were rejections. But something began to change inside him as he walked from place to place, losing track of time. Roger began to understand that the solution wasn't in the traditional jobs he had lost. Life hadn't placed him at a crossroads by chance, but to teach him something he hadn't understood before. He had to look for alternatives, that he couldn't keep clinging to the past or easy solutions. Meanwhile, Henry, in his innocence, kept waiting for his father to come back with some hope. In the distance, the child saw his father returning, tired but with a different spark in his eyes. Although he couldn't fully understand what had gone through his father's mind, he knew there was something different about him. It was that moment that Roger needed, seeing the hope in Henry's eyes. It was a reminder that his son was looking to him for an answer, a solution. Henry wasn't expecting miracles, just a sign that his father wouldn't give up. Roger knew he couldn't let the child keep seeing life through that narrow lens of despair. He decided that, from that moment on, he would change his approach. He wouldn't just look for a temporary solution, but would take control of his future, for himself and for his son. That morning, while Henry waited eagerly at home, Roger began taking the first steps toward something that would change their lives forever: the recovery of his dignity and his son's. That afternoon, something shifted in the air. Armed with new determination, Roger went straight to an organization that supported victims of labor abuse and poverty. He knew his work experience and the abuse he had suffered at the pharmaceutical company could be key to starting a process of justice. What he didn't know was how the doors would open for him. He was received by a lawyer who, after listening to his story, offered him immediate support. She explained that there were legal programs that helped people like him, who were not only fighting to survive but also to regain what was rightfully theirs, their dignity and their rights. This was one of the first times in a long time that Roger felt he wasn't alone in his struggle. However, the reality of what he would have to face was beginning to settle in his mind. He was starting to understand that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt it was worth it. That night, as he walked back home, Roger felt a mix of emotions. The physical exhaustion was still there, but it wasn't the only thing he felt. There was something in his chest that made him feel lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. He returned home with a feeling he hadn't had in a long time: hope. Upon entering, he found Henry waiting on the couch, as always, with a curious smile on his face. Roger sat next to him, hugging him with more strength than he thought he was capable of. It was then that he realized what his son had done for him. Henry hadn't just asked for help, but he had done it at a moment when Roger no longer saw a way out. Henry had been the first to believe they could make it through, and that pushed him to keep fighting. For the first time in a long time, Roger realized his son wasn't just a victim of his situation, but his greatest motivation. He knew that from that moment on, everything he did would be for him. The fight for his son, for his life, for his dignity, had begun. The next day, Roger woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't a new man, but he was a man determined. That same morning, he went to the city's employment office. At first, the responses he received were still the same: closed doors and opportunities that seemed to vanish before he could even analyze them. However, something inside him had changed. He was no longer looking for just any job, but a real opportunity to rebuild his life. At the employment office, after several hours of waiting, he finally found someone willing to listen to his story. A staff member, seeing his resume and hearing his account of his experience in the pharmaceutical sector, offered him a training opportunity for a position related to the medical field, even though it wasn't exactly what he had done before. It wasn't what he had imagined, but he was willing to try. He accepted the offer without thinking too much, because he knew that everything he could do to give Henry a better future was worth it. When he came home that day, the feeling was different. Although things were still unresolved, he had taken a concrete step toward something more positive. When he entered through the door, he found Henry playing on the floor, immersed in his toys. Roger approached him and, without thinking, hugged him tightly, knowing that although his future wasn't clear, his son would no longer see that defeated man. Henry, with his pure joy, looked up at him with a smile, as if he already knew something had changed in his father. Although he didn't understand all the nuances of what was happening, he felt the change in the air. Roger knew that there was still much to be done, but the trust Henry had placed in him that morning, when he ran to the police, had given him the strength to not give up. While looking at his son, he understood that his purpose was no longer just to survive. It was to create a future where Henry would never again have to worry about hunger or desperation. The fight was far from over, but now he knew he could count on something much more powerful than any economic or personal problem: his son, his reason to keep going. As the days passed, the small victories began to accumulate. Roger not only started to receive more positive responses regarding his new training, but life at home began to change, even if just a little. Henry, happy to see his father more cheerful, became more confident. He began to eat with more enthusiasm. His energy returned to what it had been before. And for Roger, that was a sign that things were truly getting better, even if slowly. In his heart, hope grew stronger, and although difficulties remained, he now saw them differently. There was something bigger than misery and exhaustion. There was a future that, although uncertain, no longer seemed so dark. At first, Roger feared that his temporary job wouldn't be enough to support his son. However, as time passed, the small daily achievements began to add up. He realized that no matter how far from ideal the circumstances were, He had something he hadn't had before: dignity. He no longer lived off social assistance or the charity of friends and family. Now he was working for what he and his son needed, and that filled him with pride he hadn't felt in a long time. The fact that Henry was seeing him with a new perspective, more confident and calm, was what really kept him going. It was no longer just about overcoming obstacles, but about building a life where he and his son could live with dignity. At the end of each day, after returning from work and seeing Henry, Roger felt he was doing something meaningful. Justice and redemption didn't come all at once, and everything didn't change in a day, but there was something that had been rekindled inside him: his purpose as a father. With each step he took, even small ones, he felt he was getting a little closer to stability. And most importantly, Henry was seeing his father's effort. That was all that mattered. That feeling of being a role model for his son drove him to keep going, despite the difficulties. Over time, Roger began to notice that the support from the community was also growing. Although at first he felt that people looked at him with pity or indifference, he soon started to see how gestures of solidarity multiplied. A friend he had met during his working days offered him a loan to help cover some of the debts he still had. Others, knowing his situation, began recommending him for small jobs related to his field of expertise, which, although not providing large sums of money, helped him move forward. However, the most important thing was seeing how his son, Henry, flourished in that environment of renewed hope. Henry had started making new friends at school, and little by little, he stopped being so worried about the things that had once anguished him. Seeing him smile again, seeing how his vitality returned, was everything Roger needed to keep going. One afternoon, when he returned from a small job at a local lab, he found Henry at the park, playing with other children. It was a moment he couldn't help but cherish. At that moment, Roger realized what he had accomplished, not only for himself, but for his son. He had overcome humiliation, poverty, and despair. He had given everything he had to make sure his son had what he needed: a better life. Henry, unknowingly, had been the driving force that pushed him to change, to come out of the darkness. That child, with his act of desperation, had awakened him from his stupor, and now Roger felt that despite everything, he was doing the right thing. He was creating a future that, although still uncertain, was full of possibilities. And as he watched his son run around the park, a smile spread across his face. He knew that no matter what came next, he could face any adversity because he was no longer alone. And most importantly, neither was Henry. Together, they would overcome whatever came their way. As months passed, Roger and Henry's lives began to stabilize. Although they still didn't have luxuries or comforts, something more valuable had started to grow between them: trust. The economic situation was still tense, but Roger no longer feared the future so much. He had managed to stabilize himself at work, even though it wasn't the best paid job, and he was starting to see how the situation was improving. Beyond the money, what really motivated him was seeing how Henry was developing in a happier and more confident way. He knew his son no longer saw him as the man who couldn't provide for him, but as a father who was fighting with all his strength to give him the best. The first tangible sign of change came one afternoon when, after a long day at work, Roger returned home to find Henry waiting for him with a radiant smile. The child had something in his hands, something small, a flower he had picked along the way. He told his father, with the innocence that only children have, that he wanted that flower to represent the new life for both of them. In that moment, Roger couldn't help but become emotional. He knew Henry didn't understand everything that had happened, but that simple flower symbolized everything they had overcome together. Roger, with a mixture of gratitude and relief, hugged his son with a strength he didn't know he still had. That flower, so simple and small, represented the rebirth of their family, the rebuilding of their lives. Despite all the obstacles, despite the humiliations, the poverty, and the fear he had felt, he finally felt he was doing the right thing. And the best part, Henry felt the same way. He didn't need anything more than to see that smile on his son's face to know that the sacrifice had been worth it. That moment, that flower, would be etched in his memory as the symbol of his victory, his relentless fight to give his son what he deserved. a future full of possibilities, love, and above all, hope. Roger was no longer alone in his struggle. His son had given him the greatest gift, faith in himself, in the future, and in his ability to keep going. A year later, things continued to improve for Roger and Henry. It wasn't the perfect life he had dreamed of, but it was a life full of purpose and, most importantly, dignity. Roger had managed to stabilize his work situation, though he still wasn't rich or had a large fortune. But what he valued most was the fact that they no longer lived in the constant anguish of not knowing what they would eat the next day. His son no longer showed that anxiety that had marked him for so long. Now Henry went to school with a smile, with the renewed energy that only children can have. And all of that was thanks to the perseverance, love, and struggle of a father who decided not to give up, despite the adversities. However, what truly marked that year was Roger's internal change. He had stopped being a man defeated, dragged down by guilt and despair, to become someone who could look his son in the eyes with the certainty that everything he had done had been worth it. He had found his purpose, not just to survive, but to create a better future for Henry. Although life continued to present challenges, they no longer faced them with fear. Now, Roger saw those obstacles as opportunities to grow, to keep moving forward. The community that had supported his family had also experienced a transformation. Roger began to get more involved in local activities, helping others who were going through similar situations as his. He no longer lived just for himself and Henry, but his story had become an inspiration for those who thought life didn't give them a second chance. In his heart, Roger knew he would never forget the day his son ran to the police, believing it was the only way to save him. That act of desperation had actually been the push he needed to transform his life. Although he didn't understand it then, Henry had been the catalyst for all his change. Now, a year later, Roger looked at his son with deep gratitude. Henry had given him much more than love. He had given him the reason to keep going, to get up every time life knocked him down. And so, without grand fanfare or celebrations, they two together had shown that no matter how difficult the circumstances were, with love, hope, and determination, anything is possible. And that lesson, the lesson of struggle, was something Roger would never forget. They ended the day like every day now with a simple dinner, but with an inner peace that had never been there before. A peace that can only come after overcoming adversity, with the certainty that love, despite everything, always prevails.